I'm here today on the Chattahoochee River between Alabama and Georgia, near the town of Valley, Alabama. And I'm here today to catch some striped bass and hybrid striped bass, and maybe if I'm lucky, a shoal bass or two. This is one of the large shoals that is found below Lowhead Dam that spans the river about a mile from where I'm sitting right here. That's Georgia over there. If I spin this all the way around though and look downstream, so everything below where I'm sitting right now is accessible by boat, for a boat ramp down there, but everything upstream of where I'm sitting is canoe only water, canoe kayak only water, unless you're one of the very few people who can navigate up through this thing in a jet boat or something like that. But I don't usually fish below here because, going back to what I said in the video not long ago, if I'm in a kayak and a canoe, why in the world would I willingly fish where boats can get to? Use your canoe and kayak to its full capabilities and get above this by simply dragging it upstream, and then the fish there see a lot fewer lures. Now that may not be true for hybrids and stripers because they move around so much, but it certainly holds true for black bass. So I'm about to go drag my canoe through all that, get on the other side, and see if I can't catch a fish. So dragging a canoe through this is not for the faint of heart, obviously, but it's very doable. Canoe doesn't weigh that much, slides over those rocks really well. You just have to set the canoe up, get your rods pointing backwards so they don't fall out, and get everything in there a little more secure than normal. And you have your tow rope right here, and you just start heading upstream. I choose not to use waders. Waders can be very dangerous in cold water, and it can be good too, but also can be dangerous. The current really gets a better grip on those waders than it does on just wet clothing. And of course, if you fall in with waders and you go over your waders, you have a very good chance of drowning. And this way you're just going to get cold. I do have dry clothes in a dry bag in the canoe, and also a set of dry clothes back in the car. So if there's any hypothermia issues, that's a different story. But today the air temperature is in the 60s, so if you don't stay in the water, and I won't be staying in the water here, usually you're going to be okay. Felt bottom shoes, completely a must here. These rocks are really slick. Sometimes you even fall with the felt bottom shoes. Just take it easy. Use the canoe as a steadying force when you need it. I'll tell you, it's a lot less work than you would think it is. Now, it does help to have a canoe that weighs 40 pounds. I suspect that slides over the rocks a lot easier than some of those heavier river kayaks. But still, all in all, it's not as bad as you think, but it is something that a lot of people don't do. I've learned a long time ago, after I was in my 20s and started getting like real jobs and stuff, you can't spend the time on the water that you would need to always excel at your craft at the highest level, especially if you have family and your wife, your kids, and all of that, those responsibilities on top of your job. So therefore, a shortcut is to be adventurous and find places or ways to access things that other people don't. So this is an area that is regulated by West Point Dam upstream about 20 miles, maybe not quite that far. You can see all the wet rocks that are now sticking out of the water. West Point stopped generating around noon or so, and so the water is still on its way down. Dams certainly have an effect on fishing downstream of them. Traditionally, whether it's a natural increase or decrease, or or if it's an artificial one like this case. You know, fish generally get really excited and turned on to feed when the dam starts generating or when the water comes up, and it's somewhat the reverse reaction when the water starts going down. Now, of course, here these fish are used to this. This happens every day, sometimes twice a day, and so I don't think it's quite as much of an effect, but it's certainly you get a big feeding binge as the water just starts coming up. But I don't think the fish, this isn't like a reservoir where when the water starts dropping, the fish kind of get squirrely and run off the bank and kind of hide to avoid getting stranded. These are river fish, and so rivers do naturally go up and down, and I think the fish are a lot more adjusted to it. We did a study on the Tallapoosa River with Alabama bass and red-eye bass. That's a river that's highly regulated. The water would go up and down sometimes 6 to 8 feet. And it was really interesting to see, you know, Alabama bass, as soon as the water started rising, they hit the banks and started running up areas that were formerly dry and they're now flooded. And red-eye bass did the exact opposite. They hunkered under a rock and didn't move, you know, until the water went back down. So it's really interesting how different species respond differently. You know, I don't know for sure what the shoal bass do here, but the striped bass certainly have a feeding binge when the water starts coming up and while the water is up. And they're a little harder to catch when the water's down, but you can also counteract that by, as it starts getting darker, they tend to get more and more active. So that's the strategy today, because of course the water can't be out here in a canoe or a kayak when the water is fully up here, because it becomes really dangerous. That's to say, I know people who do it, but they're either better at this or more foolhardy than I. Stripers and shoal bass make a good combination because they both are looking for the same kinds of habitats this time of year, and that is really fast flowing water, areas where the volume of current is are coming through a narrow spot. So here we have this big shoal that runs all the way across from bank to bank, and there's a couple other chutes over there, but you can look and see, if I zoom in you can see it maybe even a little better. For the most part here, most of those little flows are very small, like little creeks almost. But when you come over to this side, this is a much bigger chute right here, and this tends to be a good place for those stripers and hybrids to stack up, and also shoal bass. And this is an area where I like throwing a jerkbait this time of year because it will catch all three species. And if I'm specifically looking for stripers, I tend to throw something more like a white chatterbait or a swim bait, which of course catches shoal bass too, don't get me wrong. But the jerkbait here works really well for all three species. Stripers, you know, may bite the same lures as shoal bass, and they may hang out in the same places, but they're very different fish, biologically and ecologically. First of all, they do spawning migrations like shoal bass do, but in much greater numbers. They are not nest builders. They flood these shoal areas here and release eggs and milk at the same time, much like shad do, and suckers and walleye and a lot of other species of fish. They're looking for some kind of hard substrate to spawn over and flow. They need a certain amount of flow. Their eggs are semi-buoyant, and they drift downstream until they reach, you know, slower waters or even like a bay, an estuary, where they're timing to spawn the fish to hatch out in an area of greater food availability. One of the biggest things that stops or impedes successful hybrid or spawning of striped bass in these artificial systems is there's not enough river below the dams, or in this case above the reservoir, to allow the eggs their full time to reach the nutrient-rich waters of the lake before they settle out and get smothered. This is actually a good thing, because usually when stripers do hybridize, or when they do successfully reproduce in freshwater systems, they way overpopulate because they become a stunted small fish situation. Lake Mead is an excellent example of that. So is Lake Texoma, where you have 1 to 5 pound stripers and not a lot else. They're amazingly fecund, much more so than black bass. They spawn tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of eggs per fish, and their strategy is flood the area with gametes and with juvenile and with larvae, and a very few of them will live. And again, they're ocean fish. So here on the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic Coast, where they're native to, they're going to make it to the ocean. So spawning a ton of fry and eggs is not a big thing because they're moving to the ocean. That's a huge thing if they're moving into a 50,000 acre reservoir, which sounds big, but it sure isn't the Atlantic Ocean, which explains why they can so easily overpopulate. But anyway, stripers are very different when you fish for them. They have excellent eyesight. I'd say more so than a black bass. They're very wary in clear water. They'll come up and look at your lure and say no. That's one reason why I like to wait until near the end of the day, because as the sun gets lower and it gets harder for fish to see what you're throwing, they get a lot more stupid and a lot more ready to eat your lure. And that magic area right around dusk can be just insane. And we'll see if it is tonight.